My daughter put me in a nursing home and smiled while doing it. Until the morning my late husband's attorney walked through those front doors carrying a briefcase I hadn't seen in 30 years. She didn't even warn me it was coming. That's the part I still can't fully make peace with, even now. Not the decision itself, though that was painful enough. It was the smile. Beatrice Holloway, my only child, the little girl I raised alone after her father passed, stood in the doorway of what would become my room at Cedarwood Senior Living, and told me this was the best thing for everyone. Then she smiled, and something inside me quietly broke. My name is June Caldwell. I'm 67 years old, and I never imagined I would be telling this story. But here I am. For most of my life, I was simply a mother and a wife. We weren't wealthy people. My husband, Walter Caldwell, worked as a civil engineer for the county. I taught third grade for 22 years at the same elementary school, where Beatrice once sat in the front row and raised her hand for every question. We lived in the same house in Dayton, Ohio, for nearly 3 decades. We took modest vacations. We drove modest cars. We saved carefully because Walter always said the worst thing a man could do was leave his family unprepared. He died 11 years ago. A heart attack. Quick, the doctors said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. Beatrice was 31 at the time, already married, already moving in circles that felt unfamiliar to me. Her husband was Preston Holloway. His family owned a regional chain of medical supply companies that his grandfather had founded and his father had expanded. By the time I met Preston, the family had properties in 3 states and a name that opened doors I didn't even know existed. He was polite enough when it suited him, careful with words. The kind of man who always made you feel slightly out of place without saying anything directly unkind. I noticed it the first Thanksgiving we spent at their home after Beatrice and Preston married. The house was large. Not large the way nice houses are large. Large the way institutions are large. Ceilings too high for the conversations happening beneath them. I remember sitting at their dining table, watching Preston's mother, Sylvia Holloway, correct the way Beatrice held her fork. Not cruelly. Just matter-of-factly. As if Beatrice were still being trained. What I didn't realize then was that she was. For a few years after Walter died, Beatrice called often. She visited on holidays. She brought my granddaughter, Wren, to see me on weekends. Those visits meant everything. Wren had Walter's eyes and my stubbornness, and I loved her so completely it sometimes frightened me. I used to take her to the backyard after dinner, and we'd name the stars together. She called the brightest one Grandma's star, and insisted it followed us wherever we went. Then, the calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. The reasons were always reasonable. Preston's schedule, Resin's school activities, family obligations on the Holloway side. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. Families get busy. I didn't want to be the mother who complained. But I noticed things. Small things. The way Beatrice stopped asking for my advice and started offering explanations instead. The way she referenced we when discussing decisions that once would have included me. One afternoon she mentioned, almost in passing, that Wren would no longer be spending Sunday afternoons with me because Preston had enrolled her in a language program. I asked why I hadn't been told before the decision was made. Beatrice looked at me with a patience so practiced it felt like pity. Mom, we just thought it was best. Best for whom I didn't ask. I already knew the answer wasn't me. The first time I met Preston's grandmother, Harriet Holloway, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. Harriet was 82, sharp-eyed, and entirely unapologetic about who she was. She had built a life inside the Holloway world and expected everyone around her to do the same. When Beatrice introduced me at a family gathering, Harriet looked me over the way someone examines furniture before deciding if it belongs in the room. "You're the school teacher," she said. Not unkindly, just categorically. "I was," I said, "for 22 years. She nodded once and moved on. I was filed away, labeled, assigned a shelf. Preston was worse about it than Harriet in his way. He never said anything openly dismissive. He simply created an environment where I felt my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. At family dinners, he guided conversations toward business, investment strategies, social connections I had no part in. When I spoke, he listened with a look of patient endurance that made me feel I was borrowing time from the real conversation. Once, at a birthday dinner for Ren, he made a comment that I've never been able to forget. Several guests were discussing private school lister options, comparing programs, weighing advantages. I mentioned that the public school in my neighborhood had produced remarkable students, that environment and encouragement mattered more than tuition. Preston smiled. "That's a lovely perspective," he said. Then he turned back to the other guests. "That's a lovely perspective." 4 words that erased everything I'd just said. Beatrice heard it. I watched her eyes flicker toward me for just a moment. Then she looked away. That small turning away hurt more than Preston's comment, far more. The situation reached its sharpest point. Spring I turned 65. My knee had been giving me trouble, and for a few weeks I'd been moving more slowly than usual. Beatrice came to visit alone one afternoon. Preston was traveling, and something about the visit felt different. She kept glancing around the house, looking at the stairs, looking at the kitchen, measuring something I didn't know was being measured. 2 weeks later, she called and told me she and Preston had found a wonderful facility. Highly rated, lovely gardens, professional staff, every I could need. I sat holding the phone for several seconds before I understood what she was telling me. "Beatrice," I said slowly, "are you asking me to move into a nursing home?" She used the word community. She said it twice, as if the word itself was the kindness. I told her I didn't need a community, I needed my home. She said she'd been worried. Preston had been worried. The stairs were a concern. I lived alone. Anything could happen. I listened to all of it and recognized something underneath every sentence. This wasn't coming from Beatrice. Not the Beatrice I raised. This was coming from the Holloway family, filtered through my daughter's mouth with just enough of her own hesitation to make it sound like love. I moved into Cedarwood Senior Living on a Tuesday in April. Beatrice carried 2 boxes. Preston sent a car. Ren wasn't there. I was told she had practice. For the first several months, I did what I always do when something is unbearable. I kept moving. I joined the book group at Cedarwood. I helped organize the garden committee. I called Ren when I was allowed to, which became less often as the months went on. Beatrice visited on the first Sunday of each month, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, always with a small arrangement of flowers that felt like an apology she never planned to make directly. Preston came once. He stood in the doorway of my room, complimented the view, and mentioned that the facility had excellent reviews. Then he checked his phone and said he had a call to take. I didn't cry in front of them. I had learned long before that tears made Beatrice uncomfortable and gave Preston something he didn't deserve to see. But alone in the evenings, sitting by the narrow window overlooking the garden I hadn't planted, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. My daughter had chosen her husband's world over me. Not once, not in a moment of weakness, but steadily, deliberately, like someone learning a new language until they forget the one they were born speaking. What I didn't know was that a conversation was already underway that would change everything. 3 weeks after I moved into Cedarwood, I received a card in the mail. Handwritten. The return address was a law office in Columbus. The name on the envelope made my breath catch. Gerald Foss, attorney at law. I had met Gerald Foss once briefly nearly 15 years before. Walter had introduced us at a county planning meeting. Quiet man, careful listener. Walter had trusted him completely, which was not something Walter said about many people. I opened the card slowly. Inside was a single line in careful handwriting. "Mrs. Caldwell, when you are ready, I believe it is time we spoke." A phone number followed. I sat with that card for 3 days. I didn't know why an attorney Walter had known would be reaching out to me now. I didn't know what time we spoke meant or why it would matter. But something in that careful phrasing told me this wasn't routine. Gerald Foss hadn't sent a form letter. He had written to me personally, in his own hand. That meant something. On the 4th day, I called him. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, as if he'd been expecting me. "Thank you for calling. We arranged to meet the following week. A colleague of his," he explained, "would drive me from Cedarwood." I didn't argue. Part of me was grateful not to have to ask Beatrice for anything. Gerald Foss's office was in a brick building on the quieter end of downtown Columbus. Nothing about it announced itself. No marble lobby, no crystal fixtures, just clean, ordered, serious. The kind of office that belongs to a man who doesn't need to impress anyone. He was older than I remembered. His hair had gone fully white, but his eyes were the same. Alert, considered, kind in a precise way. "I've been holding certain documents for 11 years, he said, once we'd settled. I stared at him. "Since Walter died?" "Since before. He came to me approximately 2 years before his diagnosis." Gerald paused. He was preparing. My throat tightened. Walter, always preparing, always thinking 3 steps ahead, in a way he never made a fuss about. Gerald placed a folder on the desk between us. The edges had slightly yellowed with age. He rested one hand on top of it. "Your husband asked me to keep these until I felt the time was right. Or until you came looking." I looked at the folder. "What's in there?" Gerald opened it carefully. Inside were documents I didn't recognize at first. Financial records. Corporate filings. A series of letters on formal letterhead. I leaned forward, squinting at names, dates, figures that didn't immediately make sense. Then one name stopped me completely. Holloway Medical Supply. I looked up. Gerald watched me. "Walter was involved with the Holloways?" Gerald nodded slowly. "In the early years, yes." He explained it carefully, the way someone explains something to a person they don't want to overwhelm. "In the late 1980s, before Beatrice was born, before Walter took his county job, he had been part of a small investment group that helped fund an early expansion of what would become Holloway Medical Supply. The company was struggling then. Walter and 2 colleagues had provided critical capital at a moment when the Holloway family had nearly run out of options. The investment had been structured as a private ownership interest. Walter's share was modest by later standards but had quietly appreciated for decades as the company grew. I couldn't speak for a moment. "Walter never told me." "He intended to," Gerald said quietly. "He believed there would be time to explain everything properly." I recognized that. Walter was meticulous about timing. He wanted all the pieces in place before he spoke, and then the heart attack came, and the pieces never got to him. Gerald slid another document forward. It detailed Walter's retained ownership interest, protected through a private structure he had established with Gerald's help years before his death. He hadn't sold it. He hadn't transferred it. He had preserved it, and on a single signed page, in Walter's unmistakable handwriting, he had named me as the sole beneficiary. I pressed my fingers flat against the desk to steady myself. Gerald allowed me a moment. Then he said, "There's something else." I looked up. He opened a second section of the folder. "Preston Holloway's grandfather became aware of your husband's interest, approximately 4 years before Walter died. There were discussions." He chose his next words carefully. "Not all of them were conducted in good faith." Something cold moved through me. "What do you mean?" Gerald removed a series of letters. Old correspondence between Walter and a man named Douglas Holloway, Preston's grandfather. The early letters were cordial, businesslike. Then the tone changed. A shift appeared about halfway through the sequence. More pressure, more urgency on the Holloway side. What had begun as a professional relationship showed increasing strain, and toward the end, Walter's letters carried something I had rarely heard from him in person. Suspicion. Gerald pointed to a line in the final letter, written in Walter's hand. I leaned forward to read it. My voice was barely above a whisper when I reached the underlined sentence. "Do not allow the Holloways to acquire what was built in partnership without honoring what was promised." I sat back slowly. The words were careful, measured, but underneath them was something unmistakable. A warning. From my husband across 11 years, delivered now because the time had finally come. "Did Preston know about this?" I asked. Gerald's expression answered the question before his words did. "His family has been aware of your husband's ownership interest for years. It is my understanding that they hoped the matter would remain unresolved." The room felt smaller, and, suddenly, the pieces I had been staring at for months, the careful management of my relationship with Beatrice, the steady diminishment, the nursing home, rearranged themselves into a pattern I hadn't seen before. I wasn't simply an inconvenient mother-in-law. I was a complication, a legal one. And somewhere in that Holloway house, with its high ceilings and silent rules, someone had decided the cleanest solution was to move me somewhere quiet where I would bother no one. Gerald watched me. "Are you all right?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be." For 2 weeks after meeting Gerald, I told no one what I had learned. not Beatrice, not the few friends I'd kept, not anyone at Cedarwood who might mention it to the wrong person. I carried the information the way you carry something fragile, carefully close to the chest, without drawing attention to it. Gerald continued working. He reached out to Walter's former colleagues who had been part of the original investment group. One of them, a man named Albert Price who had known Walter for 30 years, provided additional documentation that Gerald had been searching for. Albert was in his mid-70s now, retired, and when Gerald called him, he said he had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. That told me everything I needed to know about how hard the Holloway family had worked to keep this quiet. Meanwhile, I watched Beatrice. I watched the way she arrived for her monthly visits with the same arrangements of flowers, the same careful distance, the same composed expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. I had spent 30 years learning my daughter's face. I knew when she was performing, and for a very long time she had been performing a version of herself that Preston and his family had carefully rehearsed. One Sunday she arrived with Wren, which was unexpected. Wren was 9 now, and still had Walter's eyes. She ran to me immediately, without hesitation, and hugged me with her whole small body. Beatrice watched with a complicated expression from the doorway. After Wren fell asleep on the small couch in my room, I sat in the 2 chairs by the window. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Do you ever think about moving back home?" I looked at her. She was staring out at the garden, not at me. "Do you mean to my house?" I asked. She hesitated. "Or somewhere, I don't know." A pause. "I just wonder sometimes." I watched her carefully. Something was shifting. I couldn't tell yet what it was, or why. But I filed it away. What I did not know was that Preston had recently received a formal letter from Gerald Foss. Gerald had sent it deliberately, precisely, 2 days before Beatrice's visit. It informed the Holloway family that Walter Caldwell's estate interest in Holloway Medical Supply was being formally reopened and reviewed. It was legal language, careful and specific, but its meaning was not complicated. The documents existed. They were verified, and they were not going away. Gerald told me later that Preston had called him within an hour of receiving the letter. The conversation was brief, Gerald said. Preston's voice had been controlled. But underneath the control was something Gerald recognized immediately. Fear. I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction at that, only a small one. The Holloway family held a quarterly board dinner every year at a private club outside Columbus. It was the kind of event designed to reinforce who belonged and who didn't. Investors, regional executives, family members, a few carefully selected guests who might prove useful. Preston had mentioned it to Beatrice. Beatrice had passed along the mention to me, mostly, I thought, out of obligation. I asked to attend. Beatrice blinked. I told her I would enjoy seeing people. She couldn't find an immediate reason to say no. I sat in the back of their car on the way there, and watched the landscape change from neighborhoods I knew to grounds I didn't. Preston said 4 words to me during the drive. "Should be a pleasant evening." Then he adjusted the radio. When we arrived, I understood immediately why Gerald had suggested this particular night. He was already there, standing near a side entrance, dressed like any other guest. He acknowledged me with a small nod. Nothing more. We had rehearsed this. The evening began as these evenings always begin: champagne, handshakes, practiced conversation. Preston moved through the room with the ease of a man who had learned every exit before he walked through the door. Beatrice stayed close to him. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She laughed when she was supposed to laugh. I sat at a table near the side and watched and waited. The presentations began after dinner. A board member outlined company performance. Another described expansion plans. Then Preston stood to give what had been described on the printed program as a family legacy address. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He spoke about vision, about his grandfather's sacrifice, about building something that endured across generations. He had the room. Every face was turned toward him. Photographers moved quietly along the edges. Then Gerald stood. He didn't interrupt loudly. He didn't make a scene. He simply rose to his feet near the center of the room and said, in a clear, even voice, "Before we continue, there are several matters of record that require acknowledgement." The room stilled. Preston looked up. For the first time since I had known him, His expression did not resolve into confidence. It stalled. Gerald introduced himself. He cited his representation of Walter Caldwell's estate. He stated, plainly and without flourish, that documented ownership interest, connected to the early funding of Holloway Medical Supply, had been verified and were legally intact. He held up a folder. The room had been very quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when people realize the ground has shifted and haven't yet found their footing. Preston's voice, when it came, was controlled, professionally controlled. These claims were addressed years ago. Gerald answered without raising his voice. They were not. They were avoided. He opened the folder. The distinction matters. I watched Preston's grandmother, Harriet, seated 2 tables over. She was very still. The kind of stillness that belongs to someone processing information too large to respond to immediately. Beatrice was watching me. I could feel it without looking directly at her. I turned slowly and met her eyes. Her face held an expression I couldn't quite name at first. Then I recognized it. It was the same look she'd had as a little girl the first time she understood that something she'd been told wasn't entirely true. Gerald continued. He did not dramatize. He simply presented, letter by letter, record by record, each document added to the one before it, building a picture of a partnership quietly buried, of an inheritance quietly ignored, of a widow quietly managed into a situation that served everyone except herself. When he finished, he looked toward me once. Then he nodded. I stood. I hadn't planned to say much. I had never been the kind of person who needed an audience, but I had spent 11 months being treated as though I were invisible, as though my opinions were inconvenient and my presence was a problem to be solved. And standing in that room, with those documents verified and those records acknowledged, I decided I was done being managed. My husband built things quietly, I said. He didn't need credit. He didn't need his name on anything. He just did the work and trusted that honesty would be enough. The room was very still. I spent 11 months in a care facility I didn't need, watching my granddaughter grow up from a distance, while the people who put me there believed they had solved their problem. I looked toward Preston. He held my gaze for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked away. They hadn't solved anything. They had only delayed it. I sat back down. The silence held for a moment. Then a board member I didn't recognize leaned toward the person beside him and whispered something. Then another. The murmuring began. The reporters in the room began taking notes with a different kind of attention. Preston's mother, a woman named Carolyn Holloway, who had always been pleasant in the way that costs nothing, looked toward her son with an expression that was not pleasant at all. And Beatrice, my daughter, Beatrice Holloway née Caldwell, quietly left the table and walked across the room toward me. She sat down in the empty chair beside mine. She didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. We simply sat together for a moment in the middle of everything that was happening around us. Then she reached over and took my hand. Her grip was tight, the kind of tight that comes from someone trying to hold on to something they're afraid of losing. I let her. The weeks that followed were not simple. Truth rarely creates simple situations. What it creates is clarity, and clarity, while ultimately necessary, is often uncomfortable to stand inside for a while. Gerald and his team worked through the formal legal process methodically. Walter's ownership interest was quantified, verified, and formally recognized. The Holloway family retained their attorneys. There were meetings and letters and long periods of waiting that I had learned by then to fill with other things. The book group, the garden, long calls with Wren, who had started calling me on her own when no one was telling her not to. Preston made no further attempts to speak with me directly. I didn't expect him to. Men like Preston don't apologize, they renegotiate. That's all right. I hadn't been looking for an apology. Albert Price, Walter's old colleague, came to visit me at Cedarwood one afternoon. He was a tall man, with a slow way of moving that suggested he'd learned not to hurry through important things. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street and sat across from me in the garden. Walter would hate all of this, he said. He meant the legal proceedings, the formal process, the attention. I know, I said. He'd rather it had never been necessary. Albert smiled. He also would have moved heaven and earth to make sure you were taken care of. I pressed my lips together for a moment. He did, I said. He just did it quietly. Albert nodded. We drank our coffee. The afternoon was mild, and the garden had finally started blooming. Someone on the staff had planted a section of lavender near the east wall, and on certain days you could smell it from the far bench where I liked to sit in the mornings. Beatrice came to Cedarwood 3 times in the week, following the board dinner. Not on the first Sunday of the month, not between 2 and 4. 3 separate times, unannounced, because she needed to. We talked in ways we hadn't talked in years. Not about logistics or schedules or arrangements. About real things, about her father. About what the early years of her marriage had felt like from the inside. About how slowly and almost invisibly she had allowed someone else's definition of importance to replace her own. She didn't make excuses. That surprised me. She sat across from me in those 2 chairs by the window and said, I let them convince me that what we came from didn't measure up. And I'm ashamed of that. I thought about how to answer for a moment. You were young, I said, and they were very practiced at it. She shook her head. That's not enough. She was right. It wasn't enough. But it was a beginning. The question of what I intended to do with Walter's recovered interests came up with Gerald about a month into the formal proceedings. He walked me through the options carefully, professionally, as Walter once would have done. I had thought about it already, more than he knew. I didn't want the money in the way that people assume. What I wanted was what had always been true. That Walter's contribution be acknowledged, that his name be part of the record, that what he built in quiet be given its proper place. That mattered to me more than the financial structures. What I ultimately established, with Gerald's help, was a scholarship fund, named for Walter, directed towards students from public schools in Dayton, pursuing degrees in engineering, architecture, and civil planning. The fields he loved. The fields he worked in his whole life without recognition or fanfare or anyone's applause. The fund was seeded from the recovered interest, and supplemented by several contributions from people who, as Gerald put it, had been waiting for an opportunity to say something they hadn't previously known how to say. The morning Gerald filed the final paperwork, I sat at my small desk at Cedarwood and wrote a letter to Wren. Not a long letter. Just a few pages about her grandfather. Who he was. What he believed. What he built when no one was watching. I told her about the investment, about Gerald, about the fund. I told her that the people who work quietly are not the people who matter less. They are often the people who matter most. I told her we still share a star, the brightest one. It hasn't moved. 3 months later, I moved back into my house in Dayton. The stairs were fine. They had always been fine. Beatrice helped me carry things back in. She didn't bring flowers this time. She brought lunch from the diner down the block, where we used to go when she was in high school, and we ate at the kitchen table, with the window open. And she told me about a conversation she'd been having with a counselor. And I told her about the lavender in the Cedarwood garden, and neither of us tried to fix everything in an afternoon. Preston and Beatrice's situation is something I won't speak to in detail. That belongs to them. What I will say is that my daughter has been finding her way back to herself, slowly and honestly, and that kind of return doesn't happen on anyone else's schedule. Wren calls every Sunday now. She tells me about school. She asks me to tell her things about her grandfather, and I do. Last week she asked me if it was hard to forgive people who hurt you. I told her that forgiveness isn't something that happens once. It happens in small pieces over a long time. And some mornings you wake up and realize you're carrying less than you were the morning before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That sounds like something Grandpa Walter would say. It does. I know where I learned it. People sometimes ask me whether I'm angry about the years I lost, about the months at Cedarwood, about everything I didn't know while I was living it. And I think about my answer carefully, because it deserves a careful answer. I'm not angry. I'm something more useful than angry. I'm clear about what matters, clear about the difference between a life built around wealth and a life built around character. Clear about the fact that the people who work quietly, who sacrifice without scorekeeping, who show up without needing credit, those are the people who hold everything together, even after they're gone. Walter held us together from 11 years away, through a folder in a filing cabinet, through a man he trusted, through documents that said, plainly and patiently, she deserves what was built for her. He was right. And finally, the record says so too. If any part of this story touched something in you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments below. Maybe you've been in a season where someone managed you into a corner and you wondered if the truth would ever catch up. Maybe you've been the person who looked away when you should have spoken. Wherever you are in your own story, I hope you hear this. The truth is slower than the lie, but it goes so much farther. And the people who love you quietly are often building something that will outlast everything else. Stay with me for the next story. I think you'll want to hear it.